Okay, hi everyone. So this is about a socialist defence policy. I think first and foremost the first thing to say is that a defence policy under capitalism is in the final analysis just defence of bourgeois interests. And we see in the UK how the defence policy is put together. It's determined by a plethora of different factors, including the political ideology of the ruling class, the influences of strategic business deals, for example with Saudi Arabia, that would affect the policy itself, and also the influence of political bodies and spheres of influence like NATO and the UN. How much we just spend on defence is in fact determined by NATO, and they state that we should spend 2%, members of NATO should spend 2% of their GDP on defence. For the UK it works out about 61.8 billion US dollars, so it's a huge amount of money that's being put into defence spending, and it makes us the 5th biggest spender on defence in the world. This money is spent on various different things, including like wages, pensions for service personnel, but also on weaponry and bombs and planes and etc. But most importantly, none of these bodies or spheres of influence represent the interests of the working class in any way. They exist only to defend bourgeois interests, and therefore they cannot establish peace for the working class under this basis. This can only be achieved through the dismantling of capitalism. These bodies like the UN and NATO and things are tied to the imperialist intentions of the wealthiest nations, and as such they're inevitably tied in with capitalism and achieving the wishes of the ruling class, regardless of the fallout that might have on the working class. So the fallout in the sense that it's the working class that are primarily involved in the armies being sent out to carry out their wishes, and the working class who bear the brunt of the fallout of bombing campaigns and things. And actually, in fact, what's referred to as defence by the bourgeoisie and by the ruling classes is quite misleading. When the government talks about defence, what they actually mean is attack out. And the military, therefore, isn't there in the interest of defending British workers or in defending the population more generally. Actually, it's there just to defend the profits and the interests of the capitalist classes. So in order to consider what a socialist alternative to this debacle of a defence policy might look like, there's 3 main areas that I want to focus on that I think are the biggest influences to global defence currently. The first one is the purpose and the nature of the UN. This is a global organisation that says itself that it is to take action on the issues confronting humanity in the 21st century, and some of the things that it thinks are major issues include peace, security, climate change, establishing sustainable development and human rights, this kind of thing. So big issues, big topics. It's a supposedly important body. The second thing is Trident, which I'm sure we're all aware is a hotly contested issue at the moment. Supposedly defensive, but also simultaneously completely destructive. And the third one is the army, an organisation that Lenin described as part of the armed bodies of men that defend the bourgeois state. But nevertheless, the army is a body that's primarily made up of working class men and women, and therefore we can't dismiss the interests of those people are hugely important to a hugely important part of our class. And also armies have played a really decisive role in revolutionary movements and insurrections in the past, and that can't be overlooked. So to begin with the UN, it's often seen by quite a lot of people as a force for good. I mentioned some of the things that it says that it is trying to establish, peace being a main one of those, and we can see that it plays quite a strong role in the way that we interpret international law, and it also does quite a lot of other things. It's in charge of securing World Heritage sites, and it controls the World Health Organization and organisations like UNESCO and UNICEF. So I think there is this view of it as maybe better than other organisations, but it's clearly not the case. And in fact, the UN's very establishment contradicts its ability to be able to secure peace. It was set up after World War II with the supposed interest of stopping or preventing a world war from ever happening again. However, it's governed by imperialist powers, and it can only act when those powers agree with one another that action should be taken. In reality, though, there are always inherent tensions between these powers who are competing for economic dominance on the world market. These imperialist powers sit on one of the key bodies of the UN, the Security Council, which is the body that can make the decisions of when the UN forces can be deployed. And the council's made up of the USA, France, China and Russia. Those are the 5 main permanent seats. And coincidentally, or not so, these states are all the ones that are declared nuclear weapons states, and they're the ones that are supposedly making the decisions on peace. So consequently, there are very few conflicts where these 5 major imperialist powers agree on the action that should be taken, and therefore the UN rarely acts. But this is inevitable within capitalism. The productive forces of these individual imperialist powers outstrip what can be absorbed by the sort of narrow nationalist markets of their individual nations. So capitalists are kind of forced to try and expand out and dominate other countries in search of new markets, new raw materials and spheres of influence. So what I'm pointing to here is that war is inevitable under capitalism because of these consequences, the situation of how these powers work together. Or are forced to because of capitalism. This is crucial to why there is inevitable antagonism between the different imperialists, and hence why we can never get rid of the military and why war will always exist under capitalism. So essentially the UN does nothing, and even when it tries to, it can't really achieve anything, and it can't enforce anything either. Israel's a good example for this. So we're aware of Israel's actions in Palestine and along that border. In addition to that, it's completely ignored the 1970 Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty and has developed its own nuclear weapons, going against what the UN says. And the UN has no powers to do anything against this, so Israel continues as it is doing. So what is clear from this is that the UN is excellent at conducting lots of talks, creating treaties, and making lots of promises. But it can't deliver these because of the impasse of the powers within it who have opposing capitalist interests, and that cannot just be removed. So what this ends up meaning is that UN-sponsored action merely represents like a temporary alignment of the interests of these competing powers. And the UN could only make a meaningful difference if it could somehow engineer a broad, peaceful consensus on these issues. So when the UN rules that wars are legal or that bombing campaigns are legal, all that this really says to us is that, okay, well, these 5 major powers all happen to think that this bombing campaign's okay, therefore it is, and it sort of acts to sanitize that war that's taking place. But in reality, nothing has actually changed. So all that they do is spread the illusions that the wars are just, rather than actually playing any meaningful role in establishing peace for the working class in the way that we'd want to think about it. And this is exactly what we've seen recently with Syria. The Security Council passed a resolution suggesting approval for bombing due to the fact that all 5 major powers agree that this was the right step to take. And then the resolution has essentially just given them cover to enact this bombing campaign in Raqqa. So as I said, people tend to believe in the authority of the UN without really considering who makes up the decision-making bodies and what their vested interests are. We're very quick and capable of critiquing our own government and looking at who they are and who makes them up, but we don't necessarily apply that same line of thought to the UN as well. So clearly the UN under these circumstances can't be transformed into a body or an organisation that could fight to establish peace for working classes. Ultimately, it's the existence of capitalism that's a fundamental barrier to this kind of peace. Hence the endless war and the endless turmoil that capitalism has seen throughout its history and will continue to do so as long as it exists. Therefore, when we're thinking about a socialist defence policy, we shouldn't be thinking about putting any faith in the UN. We base ourselves on working class organisations, not bourgeois talking shops like the UN is. So in a kind of post-socialist revolution world, there would be no need for a body like the UN to justify wars. What would be the need in justifying wars against one another? And the need to compete and extend markets, etc., would have died with capitalism. Currently, the barrier between nations would need to be removed if the UN were ever to function. That is the competition that necessarily exists between imperialist nations. And in order for that to be removed, capitalism must be brought to an end. So you can see that these two things are inherently tied. Thank you. So In addition, if the UN were to function for peace for the working class in the sense that it does now, democracy must exist within states that contribute to a worldwide kind of organisation of such. And again, this can only be assured under capitalism, where we can, under socialism, complete opposite, where everyone's free to participate in politics. They're not hampered by the 40, 50, 60-hour working week, whatever it's got up to now. Not hampered by additional domestic chores or by a lack of time to actually invest in understanding these issues. So as long as there is capitalism, there will be nations and competitions. There will be competitions between the nations, of ruling classes over profits, markets, resources, and influences. So the struggle for a functioning UN is inextricably linked to the struggle for socialism. These two things one makes the UN redundant almost. So the struggle is the same for that of nuclear disarmament, and this brings me on to the second major topic, which is Trident. So we're aware of Trident, what it is. It was set up by Thatcher in the 1980s, and it was supposed to, and this is a quote, provide the minimum effective nuclear deterrent as the ultimate means to deter the most extreme threat, finally becoming active in 1994. But I think we need to seriously question what that kind of threat is. What is the threat that this is supposed to be deterring? Initially, that threat would have been threat of nuclear attack from the USSR, from the Soviet Union. But now we can't really consider nuclear deterrents as a deterrent. They weren't used in retaliation to any of the major sort of threats, so like to 9/11 and that kind of thing, and they certainly didn't stop those things from happening. And we know that if these warheads were used, there's 160 in total on the submarines, and there's always one at circulating in the oceans at any one time. A nuclear winter would be caused, a complete elimination of all life on the planet. So it's madness to think that we're spending so much money on weaponry that, if used, would destroy all life, or has the potential to completely wipe out all life. So I think if it's used, it's only ever going to be used in bitter revenge to kind of counteract a use elsewhere. So it can't protect people, it can't save people, and these are the people that we're paying the taxes for this thing that can never really do anything meaningful and that would just wipe out life. So the use of these Trident missiles, I think, is really not to be considered. They exist in the minds of the bourgeoisie as a deterrent, as prevention before sort of cures might be needed to the inevitable barbarism and war that capitalism is bringing. So the warheads are up for renewal in 2020, and as I've already said, it's kind of being hotly debated right now, and it's also been, used as a club to beat Corbyn with, essentially. So, as I mentioned before, there are 5 declared nuclear weapon states in the world, and there are 3 others that also have nuclear weapons that have been developed outside of that, which means 8 countries in total out of all of the countries in the world, and the rest of them don't see any need to have these, or are also not allowed to develop them. So it's clearly not an intrinsic strategy that's needed to protect capitalist nations. So at the minute, it's estimated that replacing Trident like for like would cost over £23 billion, and to maintain it in its foreseeable lifespan would cost £100 billion. But whilst we're seriously, whilst the capitalist and ruling class leaders are seriously considering the renewal of this, at the same time, with the other hand, they're kind of enacting austerity that's going to save a few million here and there. It's ludicrous when we look at it, the amount of money that's being spent on that and snatched away from the working class and penalising the poor. The CND have some really interesting estimates on what that money could be used for, just to give an idea of what 100 billion, 123 billion looks like. And they say that the money would be enough to fully fund A&E services for 40 years, employ 150,000 new nurses, build 1.5 million affordable homes, 30,000 primary schools, or it could cover tuition fees for 4 million students. So this is a lot of money that we're talking about being spent on something that's never ever going to be used. And despite this, and interestingly so, there's been objection to scrapping of Trident by the trade union leaders. They sort of blocked the discussion and vote on it at the most recent Labour Party conference. And the positions that they hold, so this is unions kind of like Unite and GMB, is that we need to keep Trident if we're going to keep British jobs. Which is ridiculous when you think about how many jobs I've just stated in those figures from the CND, that this money could be used to kind of like support and get other jobs going and things. Another thing that's quite interesting about that is that about half of the jobs that are created by the existence of Trident are in scientific and engineering jobs, and just think what those people's skills could be put to doing if they weren't put to trying to develop new weapons or maintain weapons, just to killing other people. So it's no coincidence that the 5 declared nuclear states under the Non-Proliferation Treaty are also the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council, which helps, I think, illuminate why Trident has such an important role for the British ruling class and of those other imperialist nations. They're really keen to keep these weapons because they represent the status of the UK almost on the world stage. They act to kind of bolster its powers as a capitalist state. And again, as I said with the UN, Trident's existence depends on capitalism's continued existence. As long as antagonisms exist between the capitalist countries vying for the largest share of the market, etc., then Trident will also need to exist as a way of defending the nation state, and also to continue making that show of power that there's sort of like giving dominant credibility to the UK and other imperialist nations. So in terms of a socialist perception on this then, in a socialist defence policy, we would argue to scrap Trident and bring about nuclear disarmament altogether. Corbyn's calling for this, and other members of the Labour Party and the SNP are as well. And they're suggesting, as I've said, that the money could be spent elsewhere, which is a good thing. However, whilst it's going to save a lot of money, it's not going to be enough to replace the need to completely overthrow capitalism and have a socialist society instead. That money isn't going to last in the long term. It's a short-term fix that eventually will run out. So we shouldn't renew Trident, but we also need to understand that this won't solve any problems. It won't really create anything of a long-term lasting effect, and it won't halt in any way austerity. This will still need to be carried out even if we had a Corbyn government. We still live in a capitalist society, and this is what has to be changed. This is the thing that needs to be completely overthrown in order to fully fund a decent standard of living for everyone and remove the threat of nuclear war. So scrapping Trident as part of a socialist defence policy will only be possible as part of a plan to get rid of the military and military conflict altogether, which of course necessitates getting rid of class society, as I've mentioned earlier. A major part of that weaponry that continues as well as Trident is of course sort of the people power, so the army, the RAF, and the navy. And these are forces that have never been neutral. The state, as we know, as Lenin points out in State and Revolution, is a product of class society, and it consists in essence of, as I quoted earlier, armed bodies of men, and this includes the prisons and courts and things, organised in order to defend private property and that of the ruling class. So therefore we're against the army, not because we're pacifists, but because this is what it defends. The army exists to defend capitalist property and nothing else. However, we need to remember, and it's a really important point, that actually the majority of those in the army, there's a split of course, but a lot of people within the army are ordinary working class men and women. They're soldiers in workers' uniform, essentially. And at the minute, the armed forces has no structure through which ordinary working class men and women who fill all of these more lower rank positions can be protected against inadequate leadership or exploitation at work. There's no process through which these people can complain or kind of protect themselves against workplace exploitation. But this is important. This is important things to consider. This isn't because we just completely dismiss the army. I've said that we disagree with it, but we can't ignore all of those people who might make up a large part of the class. The army is an organisation that will be won over to the revolutionary cause, right? And we've seen this happen time and time again in history. They're not above and beyond the class, they are part of the working class. And they just act out the sort of orders of the ruling class. And I think it's understandable in a sense because we live in a society with quite a weak economy, high unemployment, very limited welfare state left to speak of, and poor education past 18. So actually the army is quite a large employer, and it's quite not a delightful prospect of working in the army, but it's a good employment option for people. So rather than alienating those who work in the army, vilifying for their actions in these wars that they've not really chosen to go into, we should seek to aid in their unionisation and win them to the cause of revolution. We saw this, just a couple of examples, this has primarily happened and was really influential in Russia in 1917, but also in Portugal in 1974. So clearly what's needed for that army then in a sort of socialist defence perspective is a union. A trade union would collectively represent the interests of those forced to work in the armed forces, and it would be able to raise doubts about the effectiveness of weapons and the effectiveness of the leadership on the people and protect their interests. Most importantly though, it would allow for an organisation for those people through which they begin to develop an awareness of their collective nature, responsibility as part of the working class, and this is a strength that far overpowers that of the sort of wealthy leaders who step into the leadership roles of these organisations and the interests that they protect. In addition, having unionised soldiers would help prevent it from being used as a weapon against the working class, which we do see regularly. The army are often used as a method to kind of restore order or bring about an end to revolutionary uprisings in some cases. So a trade union would play a really crucial role in developing the class consciousness of soldiers, and it would be able to sort of drive a wedge between the overwhelmingly working class rank and file and the bourgeois and petty officers, sort of precipitating more of a split. So under capitalism, a socialist defence policy would advocate trade unionisation of the military in order to hasten this decomposition of it along class lines. It's slightly different though after a socialist revolution. It's quite hard to talk about defence without thinking about pre and during a revolution and then post. So I think after a socialist revolution, the question of the military and defence takes on a slightly different character, where there would be a genuine need for a defensive character, like a defensive kind of organisation, something more along the lines of militias that could help defend against counter-revolution rather than how defence is thought of today, that's defending, still ruling class interests. So currently what we see is that these sort of arguments for the UK to take a lead in things, take a lead in bombing in Syria, for it to maintain nuclear weapons programme and for it to increase spending on defence. And these are often cited as necessary for like the UK to take kind of set an example on the international plane by doing these things, set an example for how we could resolve some of these issues. But this is an example that's set by the ruling class for the ruling class of other nations, and actually a far more convincing example for the working class would, which is, let's bear in mind, the majority of people, would be to set a socialist defence policy. This example could only be set by the working class taking control of the means of production and implementing a truly democratic socialist organisation in all workplaces. This is the example that would ignite the minds of workers all around the world and demonstrate what is a possible alternative. The need for defence, continued defence, rests only on the continued existence of capitalism. A global socialist federation would have no need for nuclear warheads that threaten the existence for life on Earth. It would have no need for huge armed bodies of men to defend the properties of the ruling class and the interests of them. And there'd be no need for an impotent organisation controlled by opposing forces, acting in the pretense of peace like the UN. Peace is achievable. Aggression only exists on these scales because of capitalism. I will sum up now, sorry, but I just wanted to quote... All right, okay. I just wanted to share a quote from Ted Grant, who said that there's only one force stronger than any weapon of mass destruction, and that is the international solidarity of the working class. Workers in America, in Russia, in Germany and in Britain, like workers everywhere, have their class interests in common. It is to them, not to the rulers of the world, that the labour movement must look for a solution of the problem of peace. End the system that leads to war. Fight for a socialist Britain in a socialist world. And I'd like to end kind of by echoing Ted's words. I think we only have need for a defence policy because of the systems that lead to war, that lead to the suffering and pain that's endured by millions, both in and at the hands of armies acting in the interests of the ruling classes. But if we end the system, if we bring down capitalism, we bring down the need for defence systems, and we bring down the need to waste resources and the time and the talents of the working class in killing one another. I think that is what's at risk here.